Oh,
Yep.
cool. Okay. So you should be okay now, Caroline.
Okay, lovely. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our tree health focus session on Typographers. Hopefully you can all hear and see me perfectly well. Just going to run quickly through the format for today before I hand over to today's speakers. So we've got 3 speakers today. We've got Max Blake, Alan Ockenden and Nick Haslet. And as you can see on the screen, these are the topics we're going to be covering. Sort of generally what IPS is, its biology, the wider implications. Then we're going to be looking at surveillance and site investigations, and then wrapping up with operations and licensing. Now, if you haven't been to a Teams live event before, it might look slightly different to what you're used to. In that there's no chat function, but there is a Q&A function. We'll be taking questions after each speaker has done their talk. So if you want to put in any questions using the Q&A box, you will see a box something like this. So if you click the ask a question button, we will receive that, and then we can publish those live. If you see any questions that you think is a really good question you'd like to see answered live by the speakers, if you can use the like function on that, and then we will be able to ask that live, and the questions that get the most likes are the ones we're most likely to read out. So please do use that function, and you can use that on your phone as well as on PC or tablet. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to end my slides and stop sharing. And our first speaker is Max Blake. So if you would like to introduce yourself and then start your presentation, please.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting sort of a little bit of feedback from you. It's sort of playing it twice, I'm afraid. I can't work out why that is.
Oh, I'm not sure. I can hear you okay though.
Okay, that's fine. It's ringing twice. Try leaving this. Is that okay there, Caroline?
Yeah, we can see you, so we just
Great.
need you to share your screen and your presentation.
That's very peculiar. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that, everybody. I think I simultaneously joined as an attendee and as a presenter, so I could hear 2 different voice channels from you, Caroline. But hopefully this looks okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Max Blake. I'm the head of entomology at Forest Research. I've been involved in the IPS typographus eradication work since the start. So what I'm going to do is sort of give an overview of IPS's biology, what it does here in the UK, what it does at a wider scale in Europe, what the sort of great concerns are, and then some history of the eradication work, and then a particular focus on the most recent establishments that we've been working on. The first thing to point out is that because this is a regulated quarantine pest, there's an awful lot that I can't talk about, and I think it's worth saying that there's an awful lot of work that sort of isn't in the public domain. So if some things seem a little bit vague, or potentially we're sort of cagey about answering questions, that's all why. But we'll try and we'll talk about what we can do, and hopefully it's still very useful for people. Those of you who've been to one of my presentations before may well have seen some of these slides before, and I apologise for that again, but hopefully there's some new information for everybody in all of this. There we go. So we always start a slide with the nasty stuff. This is what IPS is capable of doing in Europe. These are some photographs from the Czech Republic a couple of years ago. They've been having an outbreak over there for quite a few years. One of the things I like in this particular photograph is every single tree there every single tree that is green isn't a spruce. So this is IPS in its absolute worst case scenario. This is an ongoing outbreak that's been going on for quite a few years. That population's at the saturation point, and at this point IPS typographus can overwhelm the defenses of any healthy spruce, and that's pretty much what's happened here. They've just gone through this forest line wildfire, taken out every single spruce here, and it's been very problematic now in Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic for the last few years. I think the evidence now is that those outbreaks are beginning to slow as the beetles run out of food, essentially run out of spruce to feed on. But outbreaks elsewhere, including in France, are still still going. They're still sort of at this peak, and it'll be a couple of years before they drop down again. So the first thing is to sort of delve into is why do this? Why is it good for bark beetles to kill trees? It seems a bit unusual for species to essentially kill their host, but there's a lot of sense behind it. The fact of the matter is that trees represent a huge biological resource. There's an awful lot of food available there for them, particularly in the phloem. The phloem is an area of tissue underneath the bark, but essentially in front of the sapwood if you're going straight in. And it's this area that has got the largest sort of concentration of digestible carbohydrates, proteins, and fibers, things like that, which the beetles themselves need to feed on and reproduce. Going deeper into the wood means that you need to start digesting more and more cellulose. That gets more and more difficult, and the bark itself is also essentially dead tissue. There's very little to actually feed on there. So it's a huge resource, and there's an awful lot of species that specialize in trying to actually break through tree defenses and eat them. The biggest pests that we find tend to specialize in one species in a very particular situation. And that's because the trees themselves, of course, are very good at defending themselves. There's an awful lot of resource there. They're trying to protect it. So specialized species have evolved host-specific strategies to break through these defenses. Most trees will try and kill the beetles themselves or block and seal the wounds with a sort of repel, kill, compartmentalize strategy, as we've seen. And IPS sort of is no different to this group. So it needs very and it's sort of normal population densities. They can't take phloem that's got decent resin pressure. So when the trees are sucking up water from the soil, the resin pressure is very, very high. Anyone who's stabbed a spruce with a chisel or something like that in summer will know that it doesn't take long at all for resin to begin to come out of there. And if you're a relatively small beetle, it's very easy to get trapped and killed by that. But yeah, normally when we're dealing with IPS, the species is very much acts like any other bark beetle. So it'll have maybe 1 or 2 generations a year, depending on the temperature. Its population number is purely dependent on the food source availability. In most areas of Europe where spruce is grown in its natural environment, it's a cold montane species. Usually
Apologies, everyone. We appear to have lost Max at the moment. And so what I think we might do is, Alan, if you're ready at all, if we bring you in and then we can come back to Max's presentation after you.
Okay.
Oh,
yes, we've
hang on.
lost Max well and truly now, haven't we?
You just bear with us, everyone, while we deal with technical hitches. Yeah, okay, I think if we go on to your presentation, Alan, and then we'll come back to Max.
Will do. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna have to stop sharing and start that again. It's decided to throw a wobbly on me.
No worries.
Is that, can you see that one now?
I can see you. Just bear with us while we load up your content.
It seems to be, sorry, I'm working two screens and it's displaying on the wrong screen. I'll start again.
Not to worry. Thank you everyone for bearing with us in this technical hitch. Welcome back, Max. We were just going to go to Alan's presentation and then just give you bits of time to resettle, and we'll go back to yours if that's okay, Max. Fab. So yeah, just bear with us everyone while if you've just joined us, we are having a few technical hitches, but I think.
Fingers crossed. How's that?
Yep, brilliant.
There's nothing like starting a presentation with technical issues. Morning, everybody. My name's Alan Ockenden. I'm the Tree Health Officer covering mostly the southeastern London, but I also have a national remit. I deal with all of the quarantine and novel pests and diseases post-border within England. So I'm going to sort of look more, sort of keying up from what Max was doing, looking a little bit more about what we've been observing from our aerial surveillance programme, and also some of the on-site investigations that I've been doing over the past few years as well. I'll give a brief sort of timeline of IPS typo in Great Britain, but within England. We'll then say have a look at some of the aerial surveillance stuff, some of the survey coverage we've been doing, and some of the observations we've been making from those flights. Then bringing down, looking at some of the tree selection, and this is sort of homing in a little bit more on what Max was planning to talk about until he had his problems of sort of looking about what sort of trees that IPS typographus likes and what sort of symptoms that you'll then get underneath the bark. Also then thinking about sort of the surveillance around outbreak sites, so to give you an idea of the fact that we're not just looking at woodlands, there is interaction within urban environments as well, and some of the other agencies like PHSI. And then also sort of some of the positive proactive stuff of what you guys can do to help us out. So this is a very condensed timeline of IPS, but in 2018, in protected zone billet trap, which we have a number of those across Great Britain, there's sort of a general monitoring programme of billets, which I'm sure Nick will talk about a little bit more later on. But we had a finding of an IPS beetle in one of those in Kent in late 2018. So that kicked off a whole chain of events of initial site investigations, targeted aerial surveillance, and inspections within that locality as well. Those initial aerial surveillance flights identified about 110 sites within the wider environment across Kent and East Sussex, which we then had managed to inspect all of those by the end of February 19. So within the space of about sort of 3 and a bit months from first identification through to looking at 110, 120 sites in the wider environment. A notice, an SPHN, so a statutory plant health notice for destruction, was issued on the site and then in some of those surrounding areas as well, as a way of controlling the organism. Along with some pheromone trapping, so that was again some intense pheromone trapping on site, but then also some wider environment, so surveillance pheromone traps, IPS specific pheromone traps across southeast England. And then sort of continued aerial surveillance and on-site investigation. So we had that first finding in 18, and then we didn't have anything for a couple of years until last year, when we had some more findings in Kent and East Sussex area. So the aerial surveillance, what does it look like? So we undertake aerial surveillance from helicopter. It gives us great ease in manoeuvrability and reaction to observing symptoms in the air. So unlike a fixed wing aircraft, you can turn quite quickly, and there's a number of added benefits from using rotary aircraft. One of the Forestry Commission staff and the Tree Health staff sit in the front seat to navigate using GIS on a Toughbook, using a number of data sets which we'll have a little look at in a moment. but that then gives us that ability to sort of investigate other areas whilst we're flying as well. We're using all of that, so it's a preset flight plan rather than a go up and have a look type situation. Like COVID, for everybody else, it's caused us a number of problems. So in normal times where it's a 4 crew, so pilot and three crew operation, COVID has had a serious impact on the ability to do that. So initially, after the first wave of lockdown eased and we were able to get out and do a little bit more work, we were down to a single crew operation, so pilot and one observer in the back. So that person then had a triple load of work of navigating, operating the camera and filling out paperwork whilst flying as well. So it made things slightly difficult, to say the least, combined with the fact that normally, well, not normally, we need 2 crew to open the door whilst we're in flight. So rather than having an open door operation, it was a camera through window pop hole type situation. So it definitely had an impact on our ability, our normal service, should I say. So normally we have door open and we use digital SLRs with a GPS unit on top, which we can then extract those waypoints from the photographs out in GIS and looking at flight tracks, and we can start to digitize areas for target sites that we'd like to go and look at. So the sort of information that we use for putting together flight plans are known areas of infestation, looking at pest dynamics, so looking at the fact that it's blowovers from the continent, so we're starting to target south coastal areas particularly. We're also looking at known areas of spruce, so we have a fairly good idea of where our spruce is on the public estate. So on the map here on the right hand side, all those blue bits are spruces, not just Norway but spruces in general across the public estate. We're starting to build up a better picture of spruce in private ownership as well. So we'll use that as part of our flight planning. We'll also use data from those pheromone traps that I was talking about, so those wider environment pheromone traps, and also tree alert reports that come into us. So that map, as we were just looking at there on the right hand side, you can see a snail trail that runs across the south coast. Let me turn my pointer on and then you can see a little bit more of what's going on. So we've got a snail trail that runs across here. So this is the flight track in response to that finding in late 2018. So we undertook this flight, it was the week before Christmas, I think it was. Hence why there's a rather large hole around Gatwick, because those of you that may remember 2018, there was the Christmas drone incident at Gatwick. So the airspace was a little bit fraught around there. So we didn't manage to get any surveillance in that area at that time. Then moving on to 19. So we managed to get a sort of wider look at what was going on. So at this point, we're very much early days of the outbreak in England. We got that one site in Kent. So we were looking at as much spruce as we possibly could to determine, one, just to get a baseline idea of health within spruce, but also to try and see if we could pick up on any potential symptoms. So we've got quite a large coverage down in the southwest where there's quite a bit of spruce, and there's also an ongoing problem with Dendroctonus micans in the southwest, which could potentially give rise to more stressed spruce that we were concerned about. And again, looking over into the southeast, and then we did some flights up covering the northwest and northeast. Again, sort of thinking about why didn't we go down a Pennine strip, we were sort of trying to target potential entry points, so thinking about sort of large timber movements and high risk sort of areas. So that's why we were looking at along the coastal areas potential, or we were looking along the coastal areas. And then this is for 2020, so a little bit of a reduced service this year, or in this year. We did manage to get one flight up early on into the north, but then we were hampered with COVID restrictions. So a lot of it was mostly, well, it was all single day flights, and it was pretty much all southern half of the country that we were focusing on. But again, good coverage in the southeast and along the south coast though. And these are the flight tracks from last year. So again, sort of really starting to home in on our knowledge and understanding, and looking at the trap data now of very much looking in the down into the southeast and the southwest, just to keep a watching brief as to what was going on down there, particularly with Dendroctonus as well. So really starting to use that intelligence data to put together our flight plans. And then this is the sole lonely flight so far from this year. So this was undertaken a couple of weeks ago. And again, sort of south focused. So we'll be looking at doing some more flights as the season goes on this year, but have been slightly hampered with other outbreaks this year, as you're probably aware, with other phytophthora and bits and pieces. So it's made life a bit difficult as far as aerial surveillance to fit everything in. So what are we observing from the air? So I'm going to give you two types of scenarios here. One is the sort of dead spruce that actually might look interesting to start with, but once we've got on site and started to understand about which is the preferable sort of stressed host type matrix that we've been working out, so we'll look at the stressed stuff, but then the stuff that might potentially be interesting to IPS, and they're very different, and they look very different from the air as well. So this first one, you can pick up on a couple of dead spruce, or 3 spruce in a couple of distinct areas here. Starting to look in a bit closer, you can see they're quite dead. They're rather sort of orangey coloured. There's no retained foliage on there. The one in the bottom left hand of that exploded picture that's really rather dead. It's got that sort of white colour to it. So they've been dying or been dead for a considerable period of time. Again, a few more in this one. You start to pick them up, but when you start to look in a little bit closer, again, there's no retained foliage. They've been dead for a period of time, so it's quite easy to observe long dead spruce from the air. They do stand out quite nicely. And again here, these have been dead for a number of years. The bark was starting to delaminate from a good portion of the stem, so dead for quite some time. And when you see when Max manages to get around his technical issues in a minute, I'm sure he'll talk about the sort of that bark wood interface and how that's a really important as far as finding IPS in host trees go. So now we'll start to look at trees that were actually infested. So this one here is your reference point as we turn around. The next picture will come through 90 degrees. So we'll look at it from a slightly different angle and a bit closer in. So again, doesn't look right. You can see it's spruce and you can see it's not in perfect health, but it doesn't look as exciting perhaps as you might first think with some of those other pictures. It looks a bit meh, as my teenage child would say. But you start to zoom in on the picture and you look, there's only a year or maybe 2's worth of retained foliage on this. So it's obviously a really stressed tree. You know, spruce, you're looking at what, 4, 5, 6 years retained foliage, sometimes more. So this has only got 1, maybe 2 in places. So this is really not very happy tree at all. And this is the other side of things, which is interesting, is fire damage. So you can see the circle that's highlighted those trees in that spot. As you start to come in, perhaps might look similar to those early pictures, but when you zoom in, you can see there is retained foliage there still. So this has been a very sudden change in the health of these trees. So it's not been gradual like those first ones where you've got bark delaminating and it's starting to rot standing up. These have very much died suddenly on their feet. So these last 2 sites, those are the ones that are really interesting as far as a aerial surveillance point of view. So I'll use those 2 last sites. So you've got sort of a running theme so you can see what that looks like through on the ground. And then when we start to do our on-site investigations. So this is sort of just hammering home the message that I was just talking about. So suitable sample trees have retained foliage, ideally at least about a single year's worth of green needles, or have very recently died and have got quite a lot of retained ginger foliage. So it's that either decline to the point where they're just about to be dead or they've suddenly died. Another good one that we've been picking up on is signs of woodpecker activity. So again, sort of thinking about there's beetle activity going on in the tree. So that really helps identify sample trees. The underbark material at the base is still alive. So taking a chisel and removing some of the outer bark, you'll see that the barking underneath, rather than being necessarily bright white, it's that sort of mottled brown white sort of color. It doesn't look quite right. It's not dead, completely dead, because it will still have some sappy content to it, but it's certainly not live and healthy. Most of the bark in the upper stem will still be there, so it's not delaminated. So again, it's not been dead for a period of time. It's been quite sudden and quite recent change. The other one, which is also quite interesting, is recent Winthrop as well. So thinking about the storms that we've had over this winter, they provide potentially quite a nice resource for IPS to start an attack on, because you've got it's going to be a stress tree. The resin pressure will potentially be low, and it's emitting lots of volatiles, lots of phenolic compounds. So they'll be interesting for bark beetles in general, but also IPS. So those are ones to watch out for. Now going completely the opposite end of the spectrum as to sample tree selection as to what IPS don't like now. So you've got extensive delamination of the bark. So you'll see lots of bark, you won't see lots of bark, you'll see very little bark, and you'll see lots of white wood in the example photograph on the right hand side there. There'll be lots of rotting fungi within the wood as well. So the bark, when you might be able to peel it off with your fingers, and it will be quite like thick paper rather than sort of spruce bark. It'll be very thin, and there'll be lots of other sort of rotting rot associated inverts in there as well. So there'll be lots of wood lice and other bits and pieces. The underbark material will be either dead or very desiccated. So again, there's no suitable food source there. That's what we're really looking at here is available food resource for it to make a suitable attack on a tree. If that's not there, it's not going to waste its time and effort in trying to get in the tree and trying to survive there, because there's just nothing for it. Also, again, sort of thinking about this image on the right hand side, the branch structure is very poor or missing. So again, it's been that long-term chronic decline rather than a sudden change. Another one, sort of opposite end of the Winthrop spectrum, old Winthrop with failed root plates. By what I mean is they're no longer providing any resource to the tree to survive. So they've severed completely, or there's only a couple of roots left, and the Winthrop tree itself, you can see, looks very similar to that stuff that stood up. It's just a stick with a few bits and pieces of branches left on it. That's not of any interest either. And then the other extreme end of unsuitable sample trees are healthy trees. So as Max was saying, a tree's defense, it uses resin to repel an attack. So if you've got high resin pressure within the tree, it's going to easily repel a beetle attack. So you're not going to find any IPS typographus in those trees. So this is a on the ground picture of that fire site. So I know from the site manager that the fire went through there autumn of the previous year. And went through, it was a peat fire, so it was one of the very few bits of peat around in that area, and managed to destroy all the root system of these trees. So again, there was that sudden change on site, and that's made these trees susceptible, because they're going to be, that sudden change will make them emit a lot of volatile compounds that the beetles are picking up on to find their suitable host. This is another example of trees that sometimes yield stuff, but what's quite interesting here is there was very much a clear delineation between the live stuff, which you can see in the sort of bottom half of the surviving crown, compared to the top half, which was very much dead. So the resin pressure in that green area was actually, it was still quite high. It was all right, actually. It was more than enough to gum up my chisel as I was having a go. So obviously more than enough to get rid of a little small beetle. The top half, there wasn't anything in this tree, but it was just an interesting one to think about. What might initially start to look exciting as you go through isn't. But however, if that were a snap top that had come out that was still green and on the ground, the resin pressure will have fallen away because it's not attached to the stem anymore. So all of that, the vascular system is open to the air, and the resin pressure will drop away. Those are interesting. So snap tops have provided some quite good yields of beetles in some locations. So now we'll start to look a little bit closer into the tree itself and the sort of things you'll be seeing. So the image on the left here with the pair of forceps, you can see this is actually an entrance hole on the bark. So the beetle itself is the easiest thing to describe it size-wise. It's about the size of a piece of mouse poo, roughly. So it's about that sort of diameter. So if you think those holes within the bark are going to be about just a smidge bigger than that. So they're not particularly big, and they're also quite similar to size of other bark beetles, a little bit bigger, but not by much. So they can be a little bit sort of difficult to spot sometimes. Image on the right hand side here, so thinking about woodpecker activity. So this had a number of spots of woodpecker attack, but in underneath you can see a central maternal gallery, and radiating off of that, you can just make out a number of larval galleries as well coming off either side. So these are typical gallery formations for Ips beetles, and particularly Ips typographus. When I say Ips in this, I'm meaning Ips typographus. So the image on the right hand side, again, nice clear maternal gallery, and actually there were a couple of beetles at home on this particular case, but you got those nice neat single larval galleries. So the Max, I'm stealing your thunder because we're slightly out of kilter here, but the male will start the attack, bore in, create a nuptial chamber, emits an aggregation pheromone. First female comes in, they'll mate in that nuptial chamber, and then she'll bore this gallery up the tree, vertically up the tree, and then create a number of niches, and in each niche she'll lay a single egg, and then that egg will develop into a larvae, which is why you get this nice neat structure. It's really nice and tidy, and there's nothing else quite like it within spruce trees. There are other engraver beetles which look similar, but within Norway spruce, if you're seeing this is more than likely going to be Ips typographus. So same tree, I think this one came off of in left and right. You can see again nice clear patterns and some pupil cases as well in this one. This panel came from the top, so that panel was probably about 30 centimeters in length, roughly 40 centimeters, something like that. So now new nice fresh galleries versus old ones here. So this one still see following that very similar sort of pattern, nice central maternal gallery and all those larval galleries coming off the side, nice and fresh. This one, there was even sort of small larvae present in this one. They hadn't developed that far at this point. One on the right hand side was from that year, but was a little bit drier and had advanced. But we found this one later on in the season, probably about 6 weeks on from this one. So there's about 6-8 weeks time difference. And this tree, I think, was suboptimal, should we say. It was a good tree and it was a perfect tree to look at, but it was nowhere near as prime as this one. So the tree was stressed already. There were a couple of other stressed Norway spruce in the area, so hence why the sort of difference in the quality of the timber there as well, and the underbark material. And then starting to get down to what they actually look like. So they're about, let's say, about the size of a piece of mouse poo. There's a declivity, what looks like a thumbprint, I think is probably the best way to describe it, in the back end in either side of the elytra. So quite sort of distinctive when you get to see them after a few times. But this is, a couple of beetles. This one's probably, Max, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong here. This one is recently emerged because it's quite light brown, and the longer they've been out and as they start to mature, they go to a darker brown colour. And this was a nice picture I managed to get a few years ago of a recently emerged one as well. So again, this one you can quite clearly see that declivity in the back of the wing cases in the elytra. And this just gives me a moment not to talk quite so much if it keeps going. This is a video I collected from one of the sites this year of a busy little Ips. So this was taken using a ×10 hand lens on an iPad. So it gives you an idea. So that's sort of 10 times magnification on that. So I've shown you what an Ips looks like out in the field. I'm going to show you what's not an Ips out in the field now. So thinking about those gallery formations, they were very neat and tidy and uniform and structured. This next lot are the opposite end of the scale from that. They're haphazard and chaotic. So there are a number of, as Max had started to get to before he was, again, IT issues, there was a number of other competing bark beetle species, of which this is one. A lot smaller this time, so this is only sort of a couple of mil in length, has a rounded back end as well, so there's no declivity, and the gallery formation is very haphazard. It's all over the place. And if you look at the bark material this has come from, it's definitely suboptimal as far as Ips would go. I'd actually get this probably as far as to say it probably wouldn't like that at all, because there's not a lot of food resource there for it. So haphazard galleries, definitely not an Ips. The other one to think about is resinosis. So the bleeding, the white resin that you get with Dendroctonus micans, which is what this beetle is. So you don't get that resin flow and that resinosis like you do with Ips, like you do with Dendroctonus. Dendroctonus is quite a lot bigger, far more robust beetle, and is able to withstand a certain amount of resin flow. So you'll get that white resin candles down the stem, and then if you actually can find the little volcanoes and the entrance holes in, and then the brood chamber, again, clue here, chamber rather than galleries, you just get this big void in underneath, and you'll get adults, you'll get eggs, you'll get larvae, all sorts of development of life stages in there, all in the same spot. Quite messy, haphazard, chaotic, nothing like Ips again. So Ips very neat and tidy, Dendroctonus messy, resinous. And Dendroctonus probably about a couple of mil, roughly a couple of mil bigger than Ips, so quite a big different size when you're looking at this scale. No declivity in the back end, so it's got a rounded back end, and the pronotum and the head this end, so you're looking, there's a very different structure. Ips looks like a little brown bullet, I think is a nice description for it. Dendroctonus just looks like a bit of a bruiser in comparison. So that's giving you sort of a bit of a highlight of what we've seen from the air, and then also from on the ground, from the trees through and right the way through to looking at the beetles and gallery formations. So the surveillance that then occurs around outbreak sites. So Nick will go on to talk about SPHNs and plant health notices and bits and pieces in a moment. What I wanted to just give you an idea of is the fact that there is interaction with other agencies, so the Plant Health and Seeds Inspectorate, who are part of APHA, so their remit involves trees outside of woodlands, basically. So in outbreak sites, there are a number of different zones that are various control measures in place within those, and trees need to be inspected within those. So we've been working closely with the PHSI to inspect residential and commercial premises around outbreak sites. As far as the work that we've been doing around outbreak sites, there is an intensive survey of all Norway spruce within 1 kilometre, and then looking also at any stress spruce within that as well, and then using either local information or aerial surveillance targeting inspection of declined Norway spruce within 5 kilometres as well. So trying to get a real understanding of sort of delimiting what's going on around those sites where we're finding beetles. And now the hopefully slightly more positive bit, because that's sort of interesting, potentially a bit sort of doom and gloom really. It's about what you guys can do to help us. So we, like everybody, have limited resources and only so many pairs of hands and eyes. You guys are out there on site seeing stuff a lot more often, and you're managing those sites on a far more intimate basis than we'd ever get to see a lot of those places. So your information and understanding of those sites and changes on those sites can really help us. So if you're spotting Norway spruce that's declining rapidly, then it's really good to sort of keep an eye on that. And if you're then starting to see woodpecker activity on that stuff, that's really then starting to tick a number of those things that we were talking about earlier on. It would be great if you could just put a tree alert report in for that stuff. So at the very least, we can look to fly over that, or come out and have a look at it. So the easiest thing to do is to go through to the tree alert that forestresearch.gov.uk and use that green sort of first aid type box. That gives you the chance to add in a load of information. Please take some contextual pictures as well as you can, some close-up pictures. I need accurate information as far as following that up goes as well. So ideally a 12-figure grid reference rather than for the tree, rather than sort of a general postcode, because that makes it far more difficult for me to follow up from, particularly in the air. So quick sort of wrap up really and take home points. Host choice is very much about those stressed or recently dead Norway spruce, and particularly thinking about needle retention, wind throw after all the storms this winter. That is going to be interesting to keep an eye on to see how that goes through the year. It doesn't like dead material, so if you've got really dead Norway spruce that's got delaminating bark and all sorts of other bits and pieces, whilst that's interesting to know, as far as an Ips perspective goes, it's very low risk. So it's looking for woodpecker activity, those distinctive gallery patterns. If you've got wind blowdown that you think, well, have a quick look at that. If you've got those nice distinct patterns of gallery patterns in there, then do give us a call. There are other endemic bark beetles that you need to remember to look out for. So, and particularly if they've got in there and had a really good go before Ips manages to get there, it reduces the suitability of that material for IPS as well. So lowers the risk of that material. Not to say it's not possible to have a number of different species in the same tree, but it just reduces the risk slightly. And if you can report your concerns via tree alert, that would be most useful. Thank you very much.
That's lovely. Thanks very much, Alan. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I think one is a bit more suitable for Max, so I'll save that one. We've got one question. Do you think that the several interceptions found in Kent in 2021 could have been due to leftover populations that evaded detection from previous outbreaks and subsequent surveillance?
Not from what we've seen, and again, Max will be able to sort of add a little bit more to this, but it's been very much tied in with weather events and blowovers from the channel, from the other side of the channel. So it's rather than being that sort of leftover residual population in the background, it's I think Nick refers to them as incursions. So there's been it's recent incursions rather than that residual population.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And the other question was, would it be possible to take a journalist on a surveillance flight to raise awareness?
Possibly. That's something best off to take offline if somebody has a specific question about that.
Okay, lovely, thank you very much. So that's all the questions for Alan. So if Max is ready to continue with his presentation, thank you very much, Alan. And we will transfer over to Max.
Right, take two. Perfect. Is that working okay, Caroline?
Yep, I can see you and your screen.
That's great. Fantastic. Thanks very much. Sorry about that, everybody. The hotel decided to turn off the Wi-Fi, which was really well timed. So it's okay. I have a backup, and I'm hoping that we can continue where we left off. So thanks, Alan, for going through all of that. That helps me immensely because it means I can skip over a few bits and pieces. So the key thing to sort of add to all of this is when you, particularly in Europe, where they quite often grow spruce in lower lying areas, in more storm prone areas where there's also potentially a lot more waterlogging over winter. Remember, spruce is, a cold montane species. It needs dry environments over winter. In general, having high moisture content in that sort of time can cause a lot of root issues. And when storms come, flop the trees over, IPS is very happy to capitalize on this huge abundance of material. At that point in time, when they start building up massively on these downed trees, they can end up overwhelming spruce defenses when they build up to these colossal populations and very quickly kill trees. And at this point in time, because there's so many of them, we're talking, billions, trillions of beetles. They can easily kill trees, and that means that the populations get even bigger because then every spruce in that area is a potential resource. Outbreaks take years to build. They don't sort of build up and die down. They take a long time. But I think one key point that's always worth raising, which is I think an interesting consideration when it comes to IPS, is that pretty much every single major bark beetle on spruce has made it into the UK and established here very well since the 1800s, apart from IPS typographus for some reason. And trying to work out why that is proving to be an interesting question. I think we've got quite a good idea of why that is now, but we certainly didn't when we started off. So Alan sort of pointed out our surveillance for IPS. We very much thought that establishments here in the UK would be coming in from untreated imported wood. This happened a lot in the 1990s, but since then there's been a lot more quality control, and actually there's very little material that comes in now that's at risk to us. We haven't had an interception of IPS typographus coming in on untreated roundwood for quite a few years now, but it has happened, and we do still see what we call non-compliant wood coming in. So a lot of our mitigations are all assuming that IPS typographus comes in on this sort of material, and that's certainly something that could still happen. It's something we're very, very aware of, and doing a lot of surveillance to avoid. It's not working for some reason. So after we found the initial population in Kent, There was an awful lot of surveillance that went on that original site. It was about 5.5 hectares of Norway spruce, roughly 25 trees that have been infested, some of which have been killed. Some of which look to have been killed at least a year before. They'd been there for a good couple of years. The site itself was absolutely perfect for Ips. If you were to ask entomologists what the sort of site that Ips typographus would establish itself in and do well, this was pretty much it. Unfortunately, there was a lot of trees down, a lot of root plates up in the air here. You can see some older dead tree that's come down here, something fresh over here that's fallen. There was a lot of suitable material around for Ips. Alan was talking about some of that needle retention. You can see this quite well here. Here's a tree illuminated nicely in the winter light here, and you can see it's got orange twigs but no foliage. In the back here is a more recently dead tree, still retaining all of that foliage, which has turned orange. And yeah, I think pretty much every single dead tree here was had been infested by Ips typographus. That population has been undergoing eradication controls for the last 3 years now. This was it's worth sort of pointing out the scale of this, because not only does one need to remove the spruce from some of these sites, which you've obviously got the Ips in, the big problem is that actually 50% of Ips typographus will overwinter outside of the tree. So because all this work was going on at the start of 2019, we knew that there'd be an awful lot of Ips hanging around in the leaf litter, around the base of trees, and around sort of in all this scrubby birch, and therefore we have to install a large number of pheromone traps to pull those beetles out. This turned out to be quite a useful test of our contingency plan, which sort of discusses these 3 methods for removing Ips, and pheromone traps were by far and away the most useful method that we had. Trap trees, which are like this, where we've got a large spruce here, ring barked, and then with a pheromone lure attached to it, actually didn't work as well as we thought they would do. The resin pressure was just far too high, and they repelled almost every single Ips that attacked them. So that was really useful for us to get a handle on what worked and what wouldn't work in these situations, so that we can better prepare if it happened again with Ips, which of course it has done, or with other bark beetle pests. So Alan's kind of picked up on some of the other monitoring sites that we've got, and I'll just sort of pick up quickly on that. This is a fairly typical block of spruce used as a bit of a shelter belt in the southeast. It's fairly ropey. There's a lot of trees. There's a lot of trees down. An awful lot of spruce in the southeast just simply doesn't have any value associated with it. It's very difficult to justify going and actually felling, simply because it costs more to get a vehicle there to remove the timber than the actual timber's worth. So it's very difficult for landowners, understandably, to justify dealing with this. However, the tree health pilot grants, which I think are going to be discussed in a bit, are going some way to help mitigate this. So the initial justification for these traps was to search for missed establishments. I think Alan's highlighted done a very good job of highlighting how difficult it is for Ips to actually be found. Not only is it difficult to find the right trees in the right place that actually have them, but it's also very difficult to identify them for non-specialists. A lot of other beetles can produce fairly similar galleries to Ips typographus. The characteristic galleries look great sometimes, but there are so many galleries that I've seen from other species that look very similar to Ips, or Ips producing galleries that look like other species, that it really is a difficult job to actually identify them. And in general, it always comes down to looking at beetles in the laboratory under a microscope to identify them properly. So we thought we probably missed some establishments, although we've done an awful lot of surveillance, as Alan's pointed out. We couldn't really be certain that we'd not found that just because we hadn't found Ips, they wouldn't be there. So we put a lot of pheromone traps up to see if any of these areas had Ips typographus in them. And then what happened is we started picking up an awful lot of beetles in 2019, 2020, and 2021, actually coming into these pheromone traps. This obviously triggered a huge amount of surveillance, And again, in 2019 and 2020, actually, we never found any population. So in answer to that question earlier regarding potentially missed establishments, all of these sites have been surveyed a huge number of, a number of times, depending on the number of beetles that were caught. Some of them were surveyed at least half a dozen times, with trees, with susceptible looking trees brought down every single time, and no evidence of IPS found in them until 2021. Now, last year we had an incredibly cold spring. This is the temperature anomaly for that year. We can see that actually temperatures were a couple of degrees colder than the average in May, and then right at the end of the last week, it suddenly decided to become summer, and we had some glorious weather, which led to us catching a huge number of beetles. I think Alan's sort of gone over this, so I won't dwell on it. But suffice to say that by the end of September, we had quite a few sites. This is sort of a good example of what some of this material looks like, as Alan's picked up on. So again, I won't dwell on that one. And we have to define an outbreak very clearly as being a finding of breeding galleries by IPS on a site. It's as simple as that. And then that will trigger everything else. So we ourselves are always our worst critics. I think that's fair to say. We think very critically about the way that we approach these sites and about the surveillance. And our biggest question, of course, is always going to be, can we be sure that high catches don't equal breeding? So at the end of 2020, after 2 years of pheromone trapping, a local landowner in Kent decided to clear fell his spruce. This had been a real thorn in our side. This site, it regularly caught a large number of beetles. We had multiple pheromone traps set up there, and we had never found any IPS anywhere on that site, but we'd repeatedly caught good numbers of beetles. So we went in after the felling had been done. Every tree was on the deck, and we were able to inspect every single log. Like a little army of ants, we sort of ran out across this site, looked at every single tree, and found absolutely no evidence of breeding here. So yeah, we're as sure as we can be that high catches don't necessarily mean that there's any breeding actually going on. And yes, we've got no evidence that any of these recent findings are related to missed populations from previous years. So we needed to do some slightly different work this year as opposed to the previous years. So because we were dealing with summer, we were very worried about a second flight coming later in the year. So a lot of that material was, a lot of the forests had sanitation felling. So this is where dodgy material, anything that the IPS could potentially breed in, is removed and destroyed, which allows the rest of the spruce to remain standing until October, when it can start being felled. The demarcated area was pushed out again. The reason for this is largely to avoid issues where IPS positive material might be moved from this area further north or west into the real areas that we're trying to protect in Wales, Northern England, and Scotland in particular. And by restricting spruce movements in here, we're trying to reduce the possibility, which of course someone could do illegally, of moving material out of this area to somewhere that's going to be much more susceptible for IPS, which would cause us obviously a huge problem. So where do we stand now? Well, we still don't have any evidence of persistence on that original outbreak site. We're waiting final sign off, and it looks like we're going to be finishing off 1 more year's worth of trapping there. On the new site, we are about to start, or have already started, installing pheromone traps for the next few years, and we're extending the wider environment trapping network, which has been concentrated in the southeast, out a lot further. So I thought I'd just talk quickly about the future. We are now in a position where we are extremely confident that these beetles that we're finding in the pheromone traps are flying over the channel from sort of France, Belgium, Netherlands, perhaps, outbreaks there, and are simply being essentially blown over by warm southerly winds. This puts us in a very different situation to the scenario a few years ago, and now with 3 years of data, we can be virtually certain that every single year now we're going to be getting more IPS coming in. So this changes the way that we approach some of this work, and the long-term goal here is to reduce what we're referring to as a cordon sanitaire, an area with very little spruce, which will be sort of in the southeast, to try and protect the value of that material elsewhere. Although there certainly are very, very good high-quality stands of spruce in Kent and East Sussex, actually its worth, for want of a better word, there is very, very low when compared to material elsewhere. So what can owners do? We always try to pick up on things people can do pragmatically. We know that areas of wind blow are the highest risk, or where there's been snap. We've always recommended people actually try and go out to their sites, have a look at the spruce, identify freshly fallen or blown material, and try and clear this up as quickly as possible. And as Alan has pointed out, it very much needs live but weakened phloem to breed. Older material isn't a risk, and likewise, standing healthy material is also not a risk for IPS getting established. But of course, it is if that top snaps out in a storm. So I thought I'd just quickly whip through some of the options that people have for trying to actually deal with some of this material. The first thing is that material should be destroyed as soon as feasibly possible. It's difficult to put a deadline on this. End of March is ideal, really, possibly end of April. But any form of destruction of this material is a good thing. This all needs to be burnt, chipped, or the bark removed on site. But actually, one method that we've been recommending is piling and tarping. So here's a great example of a tree that's been cut up and piled up into a large lump. That's been covered with a tarpaulin, which has been tucked under and weighed down. What happens here is the spruce phloem rots incredibly quickly. It creates a very, very warm environment, a very humid environment, which is great for fungal growth. And what you'll see is just within a month or so, particularly when it's a bit warmer, this will just be it'll be so humid in there. There was liquid everywhere. There'll be fungal growth all over the place, and this will quickly eat away at the phloem that's here on the trees, and that will render it completely unsuitable for IPS. So this tends to be one of the best methods for actually dealing with any material that's come down, as well as fortunately being the cheapest, which is quite handy. So that's sort of one of our main recommendations if people do find material there. There's an awful lot of people to thank for all of this work. This is, suffice to say, a huge, it's been a huge operation for the last 3.5 years, and doesn't show any sign of slowing down. And just a huge thanks to everybody there. As I say, the amount of people who've worked on this is unbelievable. Really, it's one of the largest projects that we were involved in tree health in forest research. As Alan said, if you suspect IPS, submit a report through a tree alert. Remember, we can't confirm that without a lab diagnosis. So we would need to collect material to actually prove that or not. If you've got any sort of specific questions, please feel free to email me. But I'm hoping that we have a little bit of time for questions, Caroline.
Yes, we have. Thank you very much, Max. I think some of the questions that have come in, I think you have already answered. So let's start with, I think this might be a sort of a yes/no one, but presumably commercial plantations of young, healthy trees should be fairly resistant?
Yes, we tend to, well, the smallest diameter that we've seen IPS coming into is about 8 centimeters. So all the recommendation have been for material of 8 centimeters and above. That's the sort of material that IPS is going to go for. Very young plantations or Christmas tree plantations are at very low risk. The trees are simply too small for IPS to really bother with.
Fantastic, thank you. A couple which are similar questions. is it just Norway spruce we should be concerned about, or any other spruce species? And can you please give a view on the susceptibility of Sitka spruce versus Norway spruce?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So Typographus is obviously its native host is Norway spruce and other European spruces. It will certainly take Serbian spruce and Morica when it encounters that, as well as other Asian and Japanese species in its massive range across Asia and Japan. It will certainly feed on all spruce species. Sitka is obviously a big question. My colleague Dagan Inwood and his team are looking into this at the moment with a really nice lab experiment breeding ips on Sitka as well as Norway. Sitka is a very different beast to Norway. It grows in very different conditions. It's much better adapted to moist environments over winter, and because of the areas that it's grown, those temperatures over summer are going to be a lot less, which is probably going to reduce the susceptibility of it to IPS. However, there is certainly still a big risk here. The big scary thing, obviously, that's happened this year is that Storm Arwen has brought down an awful lot of spruce material in the north. That's a big risk for us, because obviously, if it's got in there, it would certainly be able to breed up on the Sitka. We know it does breed on Sitka and does okay there. And then at that point in time, you could eventually end up with a potential outbreak there. So that's sort of where the risk is. So yes, Sitka is definitely at risk. How much worse it is than Norway is still up in the air.
Lovely, thank you. Another question is, should we stop planting trees outside of their natural area? Excuse me, as you did refer to, in the natural environments of cold mountains, spruce are more able to defend themselves. Loaded question, I know.
It's a difficult one. On the one hand, there's a lot of arguments for planting non-native trees here because they grow extremely well. We've got very hospitable climate here for a lot of species, particularly those sort of American northwestern species, Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, things like that, and that provides the homegrown timber that we need, so we're less reliant on wood imports. On the other hand, that can expose them to pest and diseases that they wouldn't normally encounter, or where outside that natural range they've got more susceptibility to it. It's a tricky one, but it's probably a better one for the policy folks in DEFRA to answer, I'm afraid.
Oh, that's brilliant, thank you. So a couple more questions. When piled and tarped, would the beetles be able to overwinter in the soil?
No, ips don't live for too long, probably a few months at most as an adult. So if that material was piled and tarped before ips got into it, I think what might happen, it might be able to get in under the tarpaulin. That's a possibility. If it did, within a month, any gammaries that it made would just be completely overwhelmed by any fungi that's in there. It's so humid that will just overwhelm and kill any larvae there. I don't doubt that. If they somehow, if a tree was destroyed that had ips in it that had been missed somehow, and that was put into a tarpaulin, again, I think you'd see that even if those beetles were to emerge, they just end up caught in there. I don't think they'd be able to survive, even if they manage to get into the soil to overwinter. I just think it's just so humid in there, and the fungal growth can be so overwhelming. I think that would just kill anything that's in there.
Lovely, thank you. And final question, does chipped material have to be treated in any particular way?
Yeah, it needs to be brought down to a certain size. I think the minimum size that we've been recommending is between G50 and G100. And then there are certain conditions on its movement outside of that area, so that all needs to be authorised. But I would like to hope that Nick will be talking about that next.
Okay, and just as we've been talking, a few more questions have pinged in. So I think this is yes, no one possibly. Does it affect larch?
Ips sembrae is our Ips that feeds on larch. We've seen big population explosions of Ips sembrae in recent years. It's done very, very well. Some larch appears to have struggled recently, not just with Phytophthora ramorum, but with some site factors. And we've seen a number of sites where Ips sembrae has killed quite a lot of larch in areas where Phytophthora ramorum isn't present. So that's the big risk for larch. Typographus doesn't really go for larch. It will go for spruce. There's a lot of information on the internet about looking at host species for Ips, and if you read that, it'll basically say that almost every single conifer is susceptible. That's one of those situations that's technically true, but in practicality, it doesn't work like that. So a lot of these will be situations where Ips will be in an outbreak situation, and in the outbreak phase, they will be desperate for any food that they can get their hands on, particularly where there's been a lack of spruce and it's all been eaten by their colleagues. At that point in time, they will go for any conifer they can sort of get their hands on, preferring things like firs, pines, and larches. But that is at a real outbreak phase. There has to be no spruce left, and then they will breed on these other material. On these other materials. At that point, their breeding success is very low. They are usually just about able to keep themselves going on it, but it isn't a situation where their populations build on it just because they're not adapted to feeding on that host. So that's a long way of saying no, larch isn't a risk from Ips typographus, but it certainly is from Ips sembrae.
Okay, fantastic. Is it possible to use insecticides on the infected trees or as a preventative treatment on the surrounding trees?
It's a fair question. My short answer is no. The reasons for that are just our practicality, and I'm not aware that any insecticide is approved for use. The difficulty is trying to actually get that. It would have to be a particular type of pesticide which the tree can take up into its phloem itself, because the bark, when they're under the bark, that's going to protect them from any spray application or anything like that. It would be very, very difficult to achieve, and I don't think it's a realistic option.
Lovely. And definite final question this time. What does the name Ips typographus mean?
Great question. So typographus comes from I think it's Greek as opposed to Latin, which is the typographer or the engraver, and it refers to the engravings that they make in their galleries on the trees.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Max. Great presentation. Thank you for answering all those questions. So we will now move on to our final speaker, last but by no means least, Nick Haslet. So Nick, if you would like to turn your camera on and share your screen, and we will get ready for your presentation.
Are you getting that, Caroline?
Yep, I can see your PowerPoint and I can hear you.
So you can see the PowerPoint, and can you still hear me?
Yep, all coming through clear.
Very good. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much to Max and Alan, who have given us a really good outline of really the beetle behaviour and the investigations and surveillance for the beetle, with lots of very interesting photographs and so on. I've got the slightly pithier and drier area where I'm talking particularly about the authorizations, the operations, and the legislation that frames that. So I'm Nick Haslet. I'm the Plant Health Forestry Operational Coordination Manager. I've been involved in the Ips outbreaks going back to 2018, and I want to really set out firstly the legislation that we're currently working to, and then in the course of the presentation give a bit of a background to and context to the controls and authorization processes that we've got. So the latest legislation change was in December 21 last year, where the IPS typographers notice was number 4 was introduced, and this changed a couple of things, one of which Max has mentioned. So it defined the extent of the demarcated area, but it also very importantly defined some additional powers that have been put in place really because of the understanding that we've gained over the last 3 or 4 years on the behaviour of the beetle and the particular conditions we've got for what are sometimes called outbreaks or might be called incursions, where we're understanding better the risks associated with the beetle and the conditions we're creating on site. So the additional powers that came in from December mean there is now a restriction on felling susceptible material within the demarcated area without prior notification to us. And this has been introduced because we've understood that the beetle is so well adapted to establishing galleries on recently felled material, recently windsnapped material, and there have been a number of occasions where actually either the harvesting or the forest management intentions by a landowner have increased the opportunity and likelihood for the beetle establishing. When we saw a dozen areas established last year in these outbreak incursion sites, many of them were from snap tops, a couple of them were in areas damaged by fire, a couple of them were in areas where there'd been harvesting material left on site. So whilst we are encouraging everyone to manage their spruce to ensure that spruce stands are in as good a condition as they can be, we're also aware that we've got to be a little more careful in terms of what material is left on site and what happens to that. And I'm talking about the wider demarcated area here. We'll touch on areas under notice, under this statutory plant health notice in time, but this is constraints that cover any material within that extended demarcated area. So there's also a restriction on killing spruce trees without prior notification, because again there are sometimes well-intentioned efforts to create standing deadwood, for instance, or getting clearing areas by, for instance, ring barking, chemical injection, and so on. And we really don't want these trees that are just betwixt live and dead in that decline, because that's the condition that they are very much most susceptible. There is the retained prohibition on susceptible material being left in situ. So again, we don't want to have sites where there is, even if there isn't any indication of infestation when harvesting starts, we don't want material left on site for prolonged periods that would provide an opportunity for the beetle. And there's a prohibition on the movement of susceptible material without written authorization from the Forestry Commission, and that's where the authorization processes comes in. And this is the extended demarcated area that Max mentioned earlier. This came in with notice number 4. So any spruce within that area needs to follow the authorization process for us, both in terms of felling agreements and movement agreements, and it may only go to an authorized processor. Now, it's quite easy to look at that demarcated area and think that everything in that area is infested. From the work that Max and the tree health team have been doing over the last few years, we know that there have been 13 sites where we've discovered potential breeding populations. Most of those sites have not completed the breeding cycle because we found them earlier. And whilst there is strong evidence, well, there's very clear evidence that beetles are flying over in large numbers, there's still a differentiation between material we know is infested and that which is not, but happens to be in the demarcated area. We still have to apply controls within the demarcated area, and we've got to have sight of that material and understanding of that material, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is the same risk. There is some risk, but there's not necessarily the same risk associated with moving or processing that material as with that from the infested sites. So the felling authorization process really gives us an early notice of the intention for landowners or businesses to fell and move material. It gives us the opportunity to ensure that everyone is aware of their obligations and the opportunities. They have clarity on what and how they can move material and where it goes to, and that is a slightly complex area. It allows plant health forestry the opportunity to inspect the trees before felling, and this is important because, as Alan has alluded to, there's a fantastic bit of ongoing work in terms of our surveillance, in terms of our trapping regimes, our flights, our on-the-ground surveillance, but we can't be sure we've always caught all the high-risk sites. So this is a very important mechanism to make sure that before anybody starts felling something and moving it, we can check or double check that there's no infestation on that site. So it supports our ongoing surveillance, and it gives us the opportunity to gauge the plant health risks associated with the operation. And the plant health risks are particular. They're different from other pests and diseases, and there's an element of site specificness about them. We can then reference the data we've got from our flight surveys, our pheromone lure traps, to consider the risks for that particular site in the absence or presence of any beetle. So the process for this, which is a relatively new process for landowners, is to apply to a dedicated team via the typographus forestrycommission.gov.uk email address. The authorization team will respond very quickly within a couple of days. We will ask for some explicit information, as you can see from the applicant, which will help us manage and understand that authorization. We will record the relevant information, add it to our data systems. We will then and issue a unique reference for it. We will then carry out a survey of that site, an inspection of that site. If there is any indication of infestation, we will then pass that on to the tree health officer or the FR team, escalated for further investigation, and it is going to be issued with an SPHN. Now, to date, we've discovered infestations before anybody's requested authorization to fell or move material. So we're hoping that we're not going to be surprising any landowners, but it is a very important step for us to ensure that before we approve authorization, we have clear sight of that material, because that will determine the conditions under which we allow it to move and where it moves to. So the anticipation of the site remains symptom free. We will discuss and agree any site specific controls that may be there, which may consider post-harvesting treatment, brash treatment, whether there's other, and that will depend on a number of things, but we will agree and outline that with the landowner or their agent before the authorization is offered. So if I just talk about the specific pests, the specific risks associated with Ips typographus, sorry, it's important to understand from the start that the risks are different to other pests, and it's quite easy to consider how we have authorization processes for Phytophthora morum, for sweet chestnut blight, for Phytophthora pluvialis now, but our concerns, the risks and the process must reflect the particular behavior of the beetle, and that is different for a live beetle than it is for a pathogen or a fungal pathogen. It's different for something that is where the beetle, although it is mobile and in very heavy outbreak scenarios, there are hundreds and thousands of beetles moving around, potentially millions. In the specific circumstances in southeast England, we're dealing with generally beetles flying over from the continent in relatively low numbers. They've got to find the right host to establish. There's indications that they don't really want to fly very far. Having crossed the channel, they'll not be in great shape to be moving around significantly. So we've got to manage the expectation and recognition of the concerns we have. So the risks are really defined as the risk of moving beetles from an operational site to where they might disperse or establish. So if they're in a particular block of woodland, and we found this in the original outbreak site in Packing Wood, it appears they were there for the original outbreak site. It appears they were there for a number of years, and they didn't actually move from that site. So in the very early instances, the risk of them dispersing elsewhere is relatively low. But if we start moving material around, whether it's within the demarcated area to authorised processes just outside, there is a potential risk that we will move the beetle to a processing site. So the risks are really the risk of giving the opportunity to beetles to establish or disperse at the harvesting site, during transport, and at the processing site, and that defines our risk considerations, and all those risks are influenced significantly by conditions on site, by the conditions at the processors, by the time of year, by the weather, and so on. So we're also aware that despite all our efforts to control movement through human assisted means, i.e. through the management of moving produce and material, we're also faced with a continual blowover from the continent, and we know that because of the trap data we have. We've got a reasonably good idea of where they're arriving and at the time that they're arriving. So we've also got to balance the controls we have on moving and processing material against the known risk of ongoing incursions of the beetle blowing over from the continent. And that's helped us this year refine the authorization processes. It's allowed us to move back from a highly precautionary position, which we started with in 2018. We haven't seen conditions exactly replicable to that site since then, and we're generally dealing with slightly different circumstances. The risk considerations and controls are complex, as I've managed. We've got to start off with, is there evidence of infestation? And there's various strands of work going on to help us with that. What type of material it is, will have an impact on the risk of moving it. We know that the beetle is more likely to establish in small round wood to start with, rather than the log material, which is helpful both in terms of understanding it and in terms of whether we can allow utilization of the material. The means of transport is obviously very important, which is why there's a requirement for some types of material to be moved within certain conditions and not others. The method of destruction or utilization at the place of either on site or at the place of processing, the time of year, conditions at the receiving plant, the potential proximity of the material to a potential host. So, and I'll touch more on that in a minute, but obviously, as Max alluded to, we'd be very cautious about allowing any material from the demarcated area to move to processing sites in the more significant spruce areas, unless there were very, very extreme controls in place and we were very confident that the material had no infestation. And that's a very difficult thing to guarantee. So the time frame for processing, how long material stays on site, is important. And these considerations and controls cover both material that's under SP8 and material that happens to be in the wider demarcated area, which we are hopeful we've got a good understanding of the absence of beetles. We still have to have controls in place for moving that material, both from a legislative point of view, but also as a precautionary approach. So we then look at some of these things, because you've probably had enough of me for a minute. So I'll just run through a few photographs of method of destruction or utilization. Well, actually the safest.
Sorry, Nick, can I just interrupt a second? We've got presenter view of your screen, so we're actually seeing quite a small picture. Are you able to go out of presenter view into full view?
Is that better?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
Have you been looking at that all the time?
Yeah, afraid so.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
And Sarah is requesting control at the moment.
Yes. I think we're okay now, are we, Sarah?
Okay. Okay, well, I'll carry on. So
yeah, that's much better.
if we look at method of destruction or utilization, the safest thing really is to destroy everything on site without moving it, without giving it much of a chance, and to do that at a time when the beetle isn't mobile, so outside of the flight season. And this can be established in a number of ways. We can fell material and burn it, or it can be felled and then chipped on site. And this is what we would prescribe for high risk material, which allows some utilization, and burning significant amounts of material on site is neither practical, reasonable, or often achievable. So we've got to look at ways of being able to move material in a safe manner, and I guess the safest position is to harvest it with the usual shortwood process, and then chip it before it leaves site, either in the wood or at an agreed location. And I'll just hopefully give you a couple of minutes of explanation of that. So all this material has been felled from a site under notice. The material is chipped, and there are obviously a whole range of different chipping machines can be used. This is a relatively small one, which has the advantage of being mobile, but it also chips to a fairly fine grade. So as soon as we put material through this chipper, we've very significantly reduced the likelihood of any beetles that were found, that were not found and destroyed in situ, that happened to be in this roundwood, just by putting it through that chipper, we haven't eliminated, but we've very significantly removed the risk of moving that beetle via human-assisted means by going to a processing site. Now, in this case, the site was a relatively high-risk site, so we also required the material to be moved in covered transport. And on receipt of that material, in effect, it's going into either a destruction or utilization processing facility where it is immediately either destroyed or made risk-free. And there are a couple of options for making material risk-free. We've also got to think about the conditions at the receiving plant, and this is a shot of one of the significant receiving plants, where just the fact that the conditions around there, whilst you can see a little bit of conifer over there, there's no spruce within many miles of this site. It's actually on the far eastern edge of the demarcated area, and it's probably a greater risk of beetles flying into this area from the continent than us actually moving material from sites under notice or within the demarcated area and establishing any spread there. This is a good illustration of a site that's both in the right place, within the right conditions, and handles material from any risk category, because this site can receive material in the round or pre-chipped. This is another illustration of conditions at a receiving plant where chipped wood that has come from a site under notice is actually heated in these containers with forced air. The containers are covered, so again the material is not seeing the light of day, and should there be what is a very, very small chance of any live beetles being sent to this site, there's neither opportunity for the beetle to disperse or establish anywhere. There are receiving plants that are slightly different, that are utilising timber and utilising round wood particularly, and we've got to be sure of the conditions that they have on site. In this circumstance, again, it was a lower risk material being sent, and the bark is separated, which is the higher risk material. The material containing elements of bark where there's a theoretical transmission of beetles or particularly life forms before the life cycle has been completed, is separated, and this will be destroyed on site within in effect the same day that is being processed. And just a quick note that this is sawdust from this and many other sites, and material of this co-product of this nature isn't perceived as having any risk. There's no opportunity for beetles to persist in that, which again is important in how we manage the authorization process, how authorized businesses can handle, receive and process material. The means of transport, again, this is just an additional view of material that has been chipped on site and is being dispatched straight into the fuel hall of one of the processing sites in walking floor trailers. So this material is really as safe as it might be, because it's been chipped on site straight into walking floor trailers. It's been moved with covered transport, and then is going into a covered and secure area, and that is the most secure route, but that is obviously the most expensive. in terms of, or often the most expensive in terms of having an additional process on site, the cost of these wagons, and the utilisation for that is as biomass rather than utilising the timber. And these have been really quite difficult and complex considerations that we've had to work through, because it's very important really for some utilisation of material where possible under very controlled conditions, because that both supports and facilitates the actual activity, and secondly provides some return to the landowner, and both in terms of sites under notice, that's important, but for the wider utilisation of timber in the demarcated area, that's important, one, to ensure the landowner has some return, and that's important to encourage management of spruce. We're advocating management. We've got to make sure there are reasonably financially viable mechanisms for doing that. So secondly, the time frame for processing is important, and this is material that's come from an infested site. The operation was carried out in the winter before the beetles started flying. You can just see from this picture that the weather's improving, and this was really at a point when we were very keen to get this material chipped and dispatched to an authorised processing site, because the material itself acts as an opportunity for the beetle now, and we're increasingly aware that this is a potential opportunity for the beetles that we have seen flying over at the beginning of the spring, the warmer weather, and later on in the summer potentially. There is the, depending on exactly how that material is being processed, there's a greater or lesser degree of risk with that, because if it's going to be chipped on site and moved to a processor that is burning or processing that chip material straight away, even if we got an established gallery in there, after harvesting and stacking it at roadside, we know that material is going to be destroyed first by chipping and then at the point of processing. This is another illustration of a very successful method of destruction, and whilst this wasn't destroying a whole stand of timber within the demarcated area, it's a method that's used often for ensuring a reduction of risk post-harvesting. And again, each site is different, the economics of working each site is different, and there are some occasions where it's possibly the best idea to extract the relatively valuable roundwood from the site if we can, and then destroy the lop and top by means of rake and burn or mulching. And this was a site where a fairly significant amount of material that wasn't able to be utilised economically was then made safe by in situ mulching. And you can see the sort of size that we're getting down to. I think the next one shows it relative to my key. There's very little chance of that material being an opportunity for beetles that happen to fly in the spring following the eradication work. So we have what is I'm afraid, a fairly complicated site categorization process for sites, and the majority of these categories refer to sites that are under notice, and I'll touch on these briefly, but these do reflect the different risk categories we have for each site, and I've got some individual slides to follow this. But I think it's also very important to talk about this category 4, which is material that is in the demarcated area, but is not known to be infested. And that has allowed us this last year to have greater flexibility of how we move, transport and process that site. It is still dependent on conditions and time of year, but this is really allowing a much wider range of processors to apply for authorization. There are a great many more processors interested in that authorization process now because there's been more material available this year, and we anticipate that's going to continue for the next few years, either subject to a statutory plant health notice, or because of the encouragement we're giving landowners through engagement, through financial support to manage their spruce, and because of the recognition that felling may be brought forward for stands that are currently not infested, with landowners quite understandably taking the view that they may make provision to bring felling plans forward in certain cases. So risk categorization. Risk category 1 is the really, we've only had one site, and this was the initial outbreak site. The key thing here is that it's where there's an established outbreak and beetles have been present for longer than 1 year, and we feel that the beetles on the initial outbreak site that we discovered in 2018 may well have been there for a couple of years. It may have been subject to flyovers for a number of years. So we really had a very challenging site there because there were so many beetles present there that everything had to be destroyed very rapidly. We were also maybe following the presumption that the beetle had arrived through other means than a flyover. We were very concerned that the beetles would disperse from that site. But I think what we learned is that actually they probably stayed on that site for 3 or 4 years because there was sufficient material for them. And that's helped us understand the risks associated with these incursions. And really, in these extreme circumstances, everything is destroyed on site. There is sometimes an allowance for some material to be chipped and removed to a point of destruction via the chipping on site, moving it in a covered wagon to a point where it's not exposed to the opportunity for any beetles to release. And there's a very tight time scale for that. Now, to date, we've only had one site that we describe as category 1, and that was the initial outbreak site. And this is the sort of conditions we have on that site, where there are multiple galleries. Nearly every tree was had some infestation, and it was clear that we had to take a highly precautionary approach to that. Risk category 2, we've had a couple of these this year where there is the possibility that the outbreak may have been there for a year or so without being discovered, but also there are particular conditions on the site that either prohibit an extended investigation, or there is so much material that is just in that right condition between living and dead, that it's likely there is very significant numbers of, or potentially significant numbers of beetles on that site. And I think we've had 2 sites in this condition this year where all the material again must be chipped on site, moved in covered wagons, or to an agreed processor, to a processor that can deal with them in effect straight away. A very rapid and controlled processing manner. There's a couple of allowances that separate category 1 from category 2, particularly in terms of post-harvesting treatment. What we've seen this year, again, most of the sites we've had have been these category 3 sites, and we've been able to move to a slightly less onerous and precautionary approach with this, both in terms of what material can leave the site, how it can leave the site, how it's transported and where it can go, because the relative risk of us spreading this pest through these actions is very, very low, and relatively very low compared to the fact that we've got the beetles flying over every year. And this is where there are a number of risk mitigations in place. So firstly, the material is inspected. The material still needs to be destroyed, but we can chip it on site and remove it for destruction. The lop and top below 8 centimeters can actually be left on site, or it can be chipped on site and the chip left or removed to a place of destruction, and there might be financial benefits in doing that. We're still concerned with harvesting residues, so we're still concerned with timber that was chocks and low stumps and so on. We're still concerned with material that is left because it's unmarketable, because that particularly in that first season after harvesting does provide beetles with an opportunity to arrive and establish. That opportunity is greatly reduced and mitigated by the trapping program we have. So we have a trapping program for any sites that are under SPHN, which will act as both surveillance and interception. Sorry, I've just gone back one there. I think what's very important to consider in this scenario as well, in this meeting today, is the category 4 material. So this should make up the bulk of material that is being worked in the demarcated area, and it is defined, it's under our control, because it's in a demarcated area. We have to have sight of that material, we have to understand where it's going, there have to be certain precautions to ensure that's not going to a high-risk destination, and that it is still managed and processed in a controlled manner. But the restrictions are now significantly reduced, which we hope will support movement of that material. We'll hope support there will be some financial return for landowners that's not entirely constrained by our controls. So this allows material to be moved from the site either as chip material, which is sometimes an economic decision, or moved in the round, and that goes for the log, the bar, the small round wood, the lop and top, and potentially the harvesting residues. We don't see any risk of moving that material if it's in non-covered wagons, i.e. in standard timber wagons. There's no restriction on the material when it arrives at the processing site. There's no restriction on how we manage the co-product from that site and any secondary processing. And there are slightly relaxed timescales on the processing of that material, which is determined by a number of factors, including the location and proximity of that authorised processor. We've really realised that for processing sites within the demarcated area, there's less risk of us moving material that is under our control and from a managed harvesting site than there is with this continual flyover beetles coming into the demarcated area anyway. So the process for application for authorised processes is currently an online process. Is currently an application process that requires processes to apply for authorization. We inspect them and then issue authorization. We're hoping to move to a slightly improved and swifter authorization process for that. The fundamentals of it, that we will take an application. We need the processor to demonstrate that they can deliver the appropriate biosecurity measures. They can deliver the appropriate record keeping. They put in an application, we inspect the premises and agree an approval. We might ask them for particular elements of their operation to change, or for particular facilities to be implemented, installed. And the authorization process will determine the category of material that that processor can receive. So a processor that is receiving chipped material and burning it straight away, there's very low risk associated with that, and they can take material from category 1 right through to category 4. A business that is maybe storing roundwood for some time and is utilizing that material will be able to take material from category 4, where the assumption is that there's no material, there's no beetle or infestation associated with that site, the dispatching site. So we've now got, I think we've got 11 or 12 authorized processors, which are shown on this slide in purple, sorry, in green, and we've got a number of sites that are under authorization or have been authorized but not updated in this list. And you'll see that there are some outside of the demarcated area, and it's on the one hand it's safer if everything stays in the demarcated area, but there is really neither the facility nor the capacity within the demarcated area for both the anticipated volumes and the type of material we're looking at. But the sites that we do authorize, again, the particular conditions of that site will determine the level of authorization we provide and the particular controls we implement there. So in general, these are sites that are not in proximity to the spruce growing areas. In general, they're sites that both in the immediate and in the wider environment don't have any host material available, and they will be sites where the material is being processed very rapidly. So we have got a couple of sites up in Norwich. Those are sites that are very well integrated into the authorization process. We're very confident about the speed and rapidity that they process material. We're very confident about what they do with their co-product. They're not in an environment of spruce material, and it's probably more likely that that geographical area will see incursions blowing over from across the channel than from actually us introducing the beetle to those areas. And the same with these other areas around Stevenage and Basingstoke. They're either very secure facilities, as is the site at Thetford, although that's sitting in the middle of Thetford Forest. That's a site that receives material that's been chipped on site before dispatch, is removed in covered wagons and goes straight into the destruction hopper. We've got a site down in the New Forest, and that is immediately, it's not close to any spruce, but it's in an environment within the New Forest where there are some spruce stands. So we manage the categorization of material that site can receive, and we've got a very clearly defined process for that site to manage any of the co-product, which is really the risky material, the bark and or anything from the chipper canter. So we're actively encouraging businesses to apply for authorization. There's more work we can do on that, and I think in the future we will be hoping for maybe multiple small processors within the demarcated area that we can authorize, which will give landowners greater opportunity to reduce the haulage and find interested processing businesses which will support I guess the price mechanisms. But we're also looking very hard at other sites that can receive this material in in a safe and controlled manage in a safe and controlled managed way. Alan asked me to touch on the sort of wider surveillance and trapping, and so I've just managed to drop this one in very quickly, which is a slide that shows our wider environment trapping. This was actually a slide from that showed last year's trapping program, or even the year before that actually. And there are a couple of things here. We've got a network of pheromone baited billet traps in all the significant spruce growing areas of the GB, in Wales, in Scotland. We've got those at in proximity to processing sites as well. So those down in the south are close to significant processing sites, which might be receiving spruce either from elsewhere in GB or abroad. So we've got that ongoing surveillance. That surveillance has been going on for 30 years, and as Max alluded to, the first time we found an Ips typographus in any of these sites was in 2018. And the billet trap is basically a stack of wood, of appropriate wood. So in this case, it would be spruce. It's baited with a pheromone lure that acts as an attractant or an aggregation for the beetle, and that lure is changed a couple of times each year. The surrounding trees are surveyed very closely, and at the end of the trapping season in the autumn, all those billets are stripped of bark and checked for any evidence of Ips typographus. We do find evidence of other beetles, but we until 2018 we never found any indication of Ips typographus. We've also got Ips traps at ports, piers and processors, and this is a slightly different situation where we don't use pheromone baited billet traps, but we use a baited slot trap, which again acts as an attractant to any beetles in the vicinity. And this is in place really because of the concerns of importing Ips with any commodities that are coming from areas that have high levels of infestation. There are restrictions on what material can be brought over, but we have occasionally seen what are probably hitchhikers with controlled commodities or with wood packaging, and very occasionally material that has been non-compliant, which has perhaps had bark on it and evidence of beetles in those. Again, that trapping program goes back many years, and the numbers associated with these interceptions at the border are very low. There are no easy opportunities for the beetle to establish in that environment, so we're fairly confident that that's a pretty good level of control. We're continuing to be very active in our surveillance, and we've increased surveillance in the last couple of years around these ports, piers and processors. And we've also instigated this year a higher level of wider environment traps, which will be, I think we've just started putting them out now, but we'll increase the range of inland billet traps, forest baited billet traps, both in and around the northwest, where we've got the impact of Storm Arwen, the northwest and northeast, and in the central belt of England, where we want to be confident that beetles aren't really getting that far in their flyovers from the continent. So that's really the end of my presentation. It's a bit of a rush through. I haven't talked a great deal about SPHNs, because when SPHNs are issued, there is very, very close engagement with the landowner, with the harvesting or processing business, and the conditions on an SPHN are very site specific. We can possibly think about doing a little bit more of that. I would say that the next steps for us is to try and streamline these processes that I've been talking about. We're looking at electronic application and automatic authorization, not automatic, those authorization process, but a slightly less clunky process for authorizations. We're looking at getting increased information on the .gov website. The list of authorized processes should be going up. If it's not up already, should be going up very soon. But with that, we're going to have some of the supporting documentation about the processes, about the reasons behind those processes, and greater guidance. We've seen a new landowner leaflet be issued recently as part of that, but we'll also be looking at the mechanics for businesses who are seeking advice and authorizations. So hopefully there may be some time for questions. In addition to all those people Max has thanked in respect of the outbreak management and the surveillance, I'd just like to thank Max, Will, Ria and Robert particularly for their support in getting these processes and systems outlined, along with everyone else who's been involved in the discussions. So that's really it, the end for me. If there's time for any questions, and apologies to everyone if you were looking at the my presentation screen instead of the show itself.
That's lovely. Thanks so much for that, Nick. We do have a couple of questions. We can just rattle through a couple. From a legal viewpoint, what, if any, is the impact on the Christmas tree industry, mindful that young healthy trees and small trees are not susceptible?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, Christmas trees grown in the demarcated area are still subject to control. We still have to go through the process of inspecting and authorizing those. We have got a fairly pragmatic position with that, because we do recognize that the majority of Christmas trees are very well managed. There is a high level of both inspection and often treatment, and they're generally Christmas trees are until they reach 3 meters aren't really susceptible to our friendly beast. So until they get to 3 meters tall, Christmas trees are outside of our authorization and legislation. But when businesses wish to move trees that are 3 meters or taller, we do have a process for an inspection and authorization. Again, we've not seen any indication of infestation in Christmas trees, but there is always the opportunity for that, and particularly maybe with overstood Christmas tree plantations. We have seen some sites that are potential opportunities for beetles. So the process for that is to apply for our inspection, ideally 6 or 7 weeks before material is moved. We will send an inspector out. They will issue an authorization letter.
Brilliant, lovely, thank you. A sort of linked question. There are a lot of Norway spruce planted domestically on individual homeowner sites, often as Christmas tree relics. How much risk are they at compared to forestry stands? And also, how is all this very detailed information that you've given us in your presentation, how is that being filtered down to sort of small ARB contractors who are likely to be dealing with these kinds of trees?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think we've started at the point of highest return for the effort, if you like. I think Max may answer the question about the susceptibility of individual trees or small blocks of trees in an area where we have an outbreak. There's a very rapid surveillance program, and anything that happens to fall within 300 meters of the point of infestation is subject to a destruction order, and that surveillance is generally carried out by our colleagues in APHA, and they actually manage that destruction as part of the sort of wider environment responsibility they have. But I don't think we've seen any trees with infestation to date. We've seen material that is highly susceptible, and often it's not actually feasible to really check for the evidence of the beetle until it's been felled in these circumstances. So there's a sort of mix between precautionary and statutory requirement that does require landowners within 300 metres of the site to destroy their domestic trees, and that process then is agreed by APHA, who we've got an agreed protocol about how that material can be utilised. Individual trees are much less susceptible generally, because it's only one target. I'm not clear on all the mechanisms that bring beetles into a particular site, and there's work going on to try and understand that better, because we do get particular areas and particular sites, as Max alluded to, where we get regular incursions, but we never found any evidence of breeding beetles. So the short answer is there's less risk with that material. The long answer is that will be part of our ongoing engagement, but we're really having to focus on the large woodland blocks, the overstood Christmas tree plantations, and particularly those areas that are unmanaged woodland and forestry blocks to start with.
Brilliant, lovely. And final question, although it is a bit of a meaty one. What are your thoughts on the economic impacts of IPS, such as the devaluing or loss of an asset, costs of the on-site processing, restocking, and tree health grants? So thoughts on
it. Well, there are a number of impacts there, and it's sort of compounded, because on the one hand we're encouraging businesses to and landowners to manage their spruce, so there's likely to be a sort of increase in interest in harvesting and processing. It was really tricky really in 2018 to find businesses who would meet the requirements we had in place to get authorization to process this material, and that's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because as soon as we start applying controls on the movement and processing of material, that increases the cost, particularly at the point of harvesting, if we're looking for landowners to chip material, and secondly at the point of processing, because processors have got to meet particular conditions. There's an additional element of administration and bureaucracy. There's potentially a change in how they do things to meet our requirements. So we've had a very significant we've tried to it has been a significant bit of work this year looking at the controls that we had, and we're always looking and aiming to mitigate the impact via appropriate controls that allow some economic return to the landowner where necessary. And we've now got a suite of processors who are interested in this material, and we'll encourage more to come to the scene to maintain that economic return for landowners. It is a very complicated arena, because the value of material is really determined by the extent, the condition, the ease of access, the ease of harvesting. So it's very different for somebody who's got a small area of spruce that's in very poor condition that desperately needs destruction, to somebody who's got extensive areas of very well managed spruce, who then find there are some restrictions on the movement. We're trying to get the appropriate levels of control relative to the risk. We're encouraging businesses to become authorized to receive this material. We're doing longer term consideration of what the relative and real risks are, we've moved from the inevitable highly precautionary approach to a more risk-based approach, and there is financial support. There was last year significant financial support for businesses who were faced with an SPHN, where we were demanding action, and there is ongoing support for businesses to encourage them to manage spruce in those uneconomic circumstances. So it's a big question. We're very aware of it. Forest Services, Forest Enterprise, Forestry Commission, Plant Health Team all have the awareness of that, and are endeavouring to manage the impacts on the market that we impose, bearing in mind the bottom line is we have to treat and destroy this material for the wider sector. So there is some pain and some impact in the southeast, but the requirement for that is really looking at the much wider GB-wide harvesting sector and the landowning sector across GB. Happy to take a further question on that, but I think that's probably sufficient in the short term to give an overview of where our understanding and our aspirations are.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. There's no more questions, so I'm going to bring this to a close. I just want to say big thank you to Nick, Alan and to Max for your excellent presentations, really informative, and thanking my moderators for helping out as well, Sarah and Alan, and also to Jamie for helping keep us all on track. So you should be able to, if you want to watch this again, you should be able to access this recording for a short time using the link that you used to join this meeting, and we're also looking to put the recording up onto the Forestry Commission YouTube channel. But apart from that, thank you very much all for your time, and hopefully we'll see you at another tree event soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Caroline, and Jamie as well for providing the opportunity.
Thank you all.